The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 7, Side 2. Perhaps next to wealth, the main source of immorality was the political unsettlement of the times. The strife of factions, the frequency of war, the influx of foreign mercenaries, and later the invasion of Italy by foreign armies, recognizing no moral restraints on Italian soil, the repeated disruption of agriculture and trade by the ravages of war, the destruction of freedom by despots who replaced peaceful legitimacy with autocratic force. All these disordered Italian life and cracked the cake of custom that normally conserves morality. Men found themselves unmoored in a sea of violence. Neither state nor church seemed able to protect them. They protected themselves as best they could, by arms or craft. Lawlessness became the law. The despots, placed above the law and dedicated to a short but stirring life, indulged themselves in every pleasure, and their example was followed by the moneyed minority. In assessing the role of religious unbelief in releasing the natural immorality of mankind, we must begin by distinguishing the skepticism of the lettered few from the persistent piety of the many. Enlightenment is of minorities, and emancipation is individual. Minds are not freed en masse. A few skeptics might protest against false relics and bogus miracles and indulgences offering promissory notes for cash, but the people accepted them with awe and hope. In 1462, the scholar Pope Pius II and some cardinals went out to the Milvian Bridge to meet the head of the Apostle Andrew, which was arriving from Greece. And the scholar Cardinal Bessarion pronounced a solemn oration when the precious figment was deposited in St. Peter's. The people undertook pilgrimages to Loreto and Assisi, flocked to Rome in Jubilee years, made the Stations of the Cross from church to church, and mounted on their knees the Scala Santa, which they were told was the very stairway that Christ had climbed to the tribune of Pilate. Powerful characters might laugh at all this while their health was good, but rare was the Renaissance Italian who did not ask for the sacraments on his deathbed. Vitellozzo Vitelli, the rough condottiere who had fought Alexander VI and Caesar Borgia, begged a messenger to go to Rome and seek papal absolution for him before Caesar's handyman tightened the noose around his neck. Women especially worshipped Mary. Almost every village had a miracle-working icon of her. Now, circa 1524, the rosary became a favorite form of prayer. Every decent house had a crucifix and a holy picture or two, and before one or more of these in many homes a lamp was kept burning endlessly. Village squares and city streets might be adorned with a statue of Jesus or the Virgin, placed in a separate tabernacle or a niche in a wall. The festivals of the religious calendar were celebrated with a pomp and magnificence that gave the people thrilling interruptions to their toil. And every decade or so the coronation of a pope offered processions and games that to antiquarians recalled the spectacles of ancient Rome. Never was a religion more beautiful than when the artists of the Renaissance housed and carved its shrines, and painted its heroes and legends, and drama, music, poetry, and incense joined in the colorful, odorous, sumptuous worship of God. But this again is but one side of a scene too diverse and contradictory to be briefly described. In the cities, many of the churches were left relatively empty of men than as now. As to the countryside, hear Archbishop Antonino of Florence describing the peasants of his diocese about 1430. In the churches themselves they sometimes dance and leap and sing with women. On holy days they spend little time on divine service or hearing the whole Mass, but most in games or taverns or contentions at the church doors. They blaspheme God and his saints on slender provocation. They are filled with lies and perjuries. They make no conscience of fornication, and of worse sins still. Very many of them do not confess even once a year. Far fewer are those who take communion. They do little to instruct their families in the manner of faithful folk. They use enchantments for themselves and their beasts. Of God or their own soul's health they think not at all. Their parish priests, caring not for the flock committed to them, but only for its wool and milk, do not instruct them through preaching and the confessional or by private admonitions, but walk in the same error as their flocks, following their corrupt ways. We may reasonably conclude from the existence and natural deaths of such men as Pomponazzi and Machiavelli that a large section of the educated classes in the Italy of 1500 had lost faith in Catholic Christianity. And we may more precariously assume that even among the letterless, religion had lost some of its power to control the moral life. An increasing proportion of the population had ceased to believe in the divine origin of the moral code. Once the commandments appeared to be man-made and were shorn of their supernatural sanctions in heaven and hell, the code lost its terrors and its efficacy. Taboos fell away, and a calculus of expediency took their place. The sense of sin, the gloom of guilt, waned. Conscience was left comparatively free, and each man did what seemed to him convenient, even if not traditionally right. Men no longer wished to be good, but to be strong. Many private individuals took to themselves, long before Machiavelli, those privileges of force and fraud, that principle of the end justifying the means, which he conceded to the rulers of states. Perhaps his ethic was an afterimage of the morals he had seen around him. Plotina attributed to Pius II the remark that even if the Christian faith had not been confirmed by miracles, it ought to be received because of its morality. But men did not reason so philosophically. They said simply, if there is no hell or heaven, we must enjoy ourselves here, and we may indulge our appetites without fear of punishment after death. Only a strong and intelligent public opinion could have taken the place of the lost supernatural sanctions, but neither the clergy nor the humanists nor the universities rose to this task. The humanists were as morally corrupt as the clergy they criticized. There were shining exceptions, scholars who found decency compatible with intellectual liberation: Ambrogio Traversari, Vittorino da Feltre, Marsilio Ficino, Aldus Manutius. But an impressively large minority of the men who resurrected Greek and Roman literature lived like pagans who had never heard of Christianity. Their mobility deracinated them. They passed from city to city seeking laurels and fees and sank no roots in stability. They were as fond of money as any moneylender or his wife. They were vain of their genius, their income, their features, their dress. They were coarse in their speech, ungenerous and disgraceful in their controversies, faithless in their friendships and transient in their loves. Ariosto, as we have noted, dared not trust his son to a humanist tutor for fear of moral contamination. Probably he found it unnecessary to forbid the boy to read Orlando Furioso, which was salted with melodious obscenity. Valla, Poggio, Beccadelli, Filelfo summarized in their loose lives one of the basic problems of ethics and civilization. Must a moral code, to function effectively, have supernatural sanctions, the belief in another life, or in the divine origin of the moral code? 2. The morals of the clergy. The Church might have sustained the supernatural sanctions provided by the Hebraic scriptures and the Christian tradition if her personnel had led lives of decency and devotion. But most of them accepted the bad as well as the good in the morals of the time, and reflected the antithetical facets of the laity. The parish priest was a simple ministrant, usually of slight education, but normally, Pace the good Antonino, leading an exemplary life. Ignored by the intelligentsia, but welcomed by the people. Among the bishops and abbots there were some high livers, but many good men, and perhaps half the College of Cardinals maintained a pious and Christian conduct that shamed the gay worldliness of their colleagues. All over Italy there were hospitals, orphan asylums, schools, almshouses, Monti di Pietà, loan offices, and other charitable institutions managed by the clergy. The Benedictine, Observantine, and Carthusian monks were honored for the relatively high moral level of their lives. Missionaries faced 1,000 dangers to spread the faith in heathen lands and among the pagans of Christendom. Mystics hid themselves away from the violence of the times and sought closer communion with God. Amid this devotion there was so much laxity of morals among the clergy that 1,000 testimonies could be adduced to prove it. The same Petrarch who remained faithful to Christianity to the end, and who drew a favorable picture of discipline and piety in the Carthusian monastery where his brother lived, repeatedly denounced the morals of the clergy in Avignon. From the Novelle of Boccaccio in the 14th century, through those of Masuccio in the 15th, to those of Bandello in the 16th, the loose lives of the Italian clergy form a recurrent theme of Italian literature. Boccaccio speaks of the lewd and filthy life of the clergy, in sins natural or sodomitical. Masuccio described the monks and friars as ministers of Satan, addicted to fornication, homosexualism, avarice, simony, and impiety, and professed to have found a higher moral level in the army than in the clergy. Aretino, familiar with all filth, railed at the errors of printers as rivaling in number the sins of the clergy. Truly, it would be easier to find Rome sober and chaste than a correct book. Poggio almost exhausts his vocabulary of vituperation in exposing the immorality, hypocrisy, cupidity, ignorance, and arrogance of monks and priests. And Folengo's Orlandino tells the same tale. Apparently the nuns, who today are angels and ministers of grace, shared in the revelry. They were especially lively in Venice, where monasteries and nunneries were sufficiently close to each other to allow their inmates now and then to share a bed. The archives of the Provveditori Sopra Monasteri contain 20 volumes of trials for the cohabitation of monks and nuns. Aretino speaks unquotably about the nuns of Venice, and Guicciardini, usually temperate, loses his poise in describing Rome. Of the court of Rome it is impossible to speak with sufficient severity, for it is a standing infamy, an example of all that is most vile and shameful in the world. These testimonies seem exaggerated and may be prejudiced, but here's St. Catherine of Siena. On whatever side you turn, whether to the secular clergy of priests and bishops, or to the religious orders, or to prelates small or great, old or young, you see nothing but offences, and all stink in my nostrils with a stench of mortal sin. Narrow, greedy, avaricious, they have abandoned the care of souls. Making a god of their belly, eating and drinking in disorderly feast, they fall thenceforthwith into filth, living in lasciviousness, feeding their children with the substance of the poor. They flee from choir service as from poison. Here again we must discount something, since no saint can be trusted to speak of human conduct without indignation. But we may accept the summing up of a candid Catholic historian. It is not surprising, when the highest ranks of the clergy were in such a state, that among the regular orders and secular priests, vice and irregularities of all sorts should have become more and more common. The salt of the earth had lost its savour. It was such priests as these that gave occasion to the more or less exaggerated descriptions of the clergy by Erasmus and Luther, who visited Rome during the reign of Julius II. But it is a mistake to suppose that the corruption of the clergy was worse in Rome than elsewhere. There is documentary evidence of the immorality of the priests in almost every town in the Italian peninsula. In many places, Venice, for instance, matters were far worse than in Rome. No wonder, as contemporary writers sadly testify, the influence of the clergy had declined, and that in many places hardly any respect was shown for the priesthood. Their immorality was so gross that suggestions in favor of allowing priests to marry began to be heard. Many of the monasteries were in a deplorable condition. The three essential vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were in some convents almost entirely disregarded. The discipline of many convents of nuns was equally lax. Less forgivable than irregularities of sex and festivities of diet were the activities of the Inquisition. But these remarkably declined in Italy during the 15th century. In 1440, Amadeo de' Landi, a mathematician, was tried on a charge of materialism, but was acquitted. In 1478, Galeotto Marcio was condemned to death for writing that any man who lived a good life would go to heaven, whatever his religion might be. But Pope Sixtus IV saved him. In 1497, the physician Gabriele da Salo was protected from the Inquisition by his patients, though he maintained that Christ was not God, but was the son of Joseph and Mary, conceived in the usual ridiculous way, that Christ's body was not in the consecrated wafer, and that his miracles had been performed not by divine power, but through the influence of the stars. So one myth drives out another. In 1500, Giorgio de Novara was burnt to death at Bologna, apparently for denying the divinity of Christ without having influential friends. In the same year, the Bishop of Aranda declared with impunity that there is neither heaven nor hell, and that indulgences were merely a means of raising funds. In 1510, when Ferdinand the Catholic tried to introduce the Inquisition into Naples, he met with such determined resistance from all classes of the population that he had to abandon the attempt. Amid the ecclesiastical decay, there were several centers of wholesome reform. Pius II deposed a general of the Dominicans and disciplined lax monasteries in Venice, Brescia, Florence, and Siena. In 1517, Sadoleto, Ghiberti, Carafa, and other churchmen founded the Oratory of the Divine Love as a center for pious men who desired some refuge from the pagan worldliness of Rome. In 1523, Carafa organized the Order of Theatines, in which secular priests lived under monastic rules of chastity, obedience, and poverty. Cardinal Carafa resigned all his benefices and distributed his property among the poor. So did St. Gaetano, another founder of the Theatines. These devotees, many of them men of noble lineage and great wealth, astonished Rome by strict adherence to their self-imposed rules and their fearless visits to victims of the plague. In 1533, Antonio Maria Zaccaria established at Milan a similar community of priests, first called the Regular Clerics of St. Paul, but soon to be known as Barnabites from the Church of St. Barnabas. Carafa drew up a helpful program of reform for the clergy of Venice, and Ghiberti essayed similar reforms in the Diocese of Verona from 1528 to 1531. Egidio Canisio reformed the Augustinian Eremites, and Gregorio Cortese effected a similar betterment among the Benedictines at Padua. The outstanding effort at monastic reform in this age was the foundation of the Capuchin order. Matteo di Bassi, a friar of the Franciscan Observantines at Montefalcone, thought that he saw St. Francis in a vision, and that he heard him say, "I wish my rule to be observed to the letter, to the letter, to the letter." Learning that St. Francis had worn a four-cornered painted hood, he adopted that headdress. Going to Rome, he secured from Clement VII in 1528 permission to establish a new branch of the Franciscans, distinguished by the cappuccio, or cowl, and by firm adherence to the final rule of St. Francis. They dressed in the coarsest cloth, went barefoot throughout the year, lived on bread, vegetables, fruit, and water, kept rigorous fasts, dwelt in narrow cells in poor cottages made of wood and loam, and never journeyed except on foot. The new order was not numerous, but it gave a stirring example and stimulus to the more widespread self-reform that came to the monastic and mendicant orders in the 16th and 17th centuries. Some of these reforms were undertaken in response to the Protestant Reformation. Many of them were of spontaneous generation and indicated a saving vitality in Christianity and the Church. 3. Sexual morality. Turning now to laic morals, and beginning with the relations of the sexes, we should remind ourselves at the outset that man is by nature polygamous, and that only the strongest moral sanctions, a helpful degree of poverty and hard work, and uninterrupted wifely supervision can induce him to monogamy. It is not clear that adultery was less popular in the Middle Ages than in the Renaissance, and as medieval adultery was tempered with chivalry, so in the Renaissance it was softened, in the lettered classes, by an idealization of the refinement and spiritual charms of the educated woman. Greater equality of the sexes in education and social standing made possible a new intellectual comradeship between men and women. In Mantua, Milan, Urbino, Ferrara, and Naples, life was graced and stirred by the prominence of attractive and cultivated women. Girls of good family were kept in relative seclusion from men not of their own household. They were sedulously instructed in the advantages of premarital chastity, sometimes with such success that we hear of a young woman drowning herself after being raped. She was doubtless exceptional, for a bishop proposed to raise a statue to her. In the Roman catacombs, a young gentlewoman strangled herself to avoid seduction. Her body was borne in triumph through the streets of Rome with a laurel crown on her head. Nevertheless, there must have been considerable premarital adventure. Otherwise it would be difficult to account for the extraordinary number of bastards to be found in any city of Renaissance Italy. Not to have bastards was a distinction. To have them was no serious disgrace. The man, on marrying, usually persuaded his wife to let his illegitimate progeny join the household and be brought up with her own children. To be a bastard was no great disability. The social stigma involved was almost negligible. Legitimation could be obtained by lubricating an ecclesiastical hand. In default of legitimate and competent heirs, bastard sons could succeed to an estate, even to a throne, as Ferrante I succeeded Alfonso I at Naples, and as Leonello d'Este succeeded Niccolo III at Ferrara. When Pius II came to Ferrara in 1459, he was received by 7 princes, all illegitimate. The rivalry of bastards with legitimate sons was a rich source of Renaissance violence. Half the novelle turn on seductions, and usually such stories were read or heard by women with only a momentary lowering of the eyes. Robert, Bishop of Aquino, toward the close of the 15th century, described the morals of the young men in his diocese as unashamedly corrupt. They explained to him, he tells us, that fornication was no sin, that chastity was an old-fashioned taboo, and that virginity was on the wane. Even incest had its devotees. As for homosexuality, it became almost an obligatory part of the Greek revival. The humanists wrote about it with a kind of scholarly affection, and Ariosto judged that they were all addicted to it. Politian, Filippo Strozzi, and the diarist Sanudo were reasonably suspected of it. Michelangelo, Julius II, and Clement VII were less convincingly charged with it. San Bernardino found so much of it in Naples that he threatened the city with the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Aretino described the aberration as quite popular in Rome, and he himself, between one mistress and another, asked the Duke of Mantua to send him an attractive boy. In 1455, the Venetian Council of Ten took official note how the abominable vice of sodomy multiplies in this city, and to avert the wrath of God, it appointed 2 men in each quarter of Venice to put down the practice. The council noted that some men had taken to wearing feminine garb, and that some women were adopting male attire, and it called this a species of sodomy. In 1492, a noble and a priest convicted of homosexual acts were beheaded in the Piazzetta, and their bodies were publicly burned. These, of course, were exceptional cases from which we must not generalize, but we may assume that homosexuality was more than normally present in Renaissance Italy until the Counter-Reformation. We may say likewise of prostitution. According to Infessura, who liked to load his statistics against Papal Rome, there were 6,800 registered prostitutes in Rome in 1490, not counting clandestine practitioners, in a population of some 90,000. In Venice, the census of 1509 reported 11,654 prostitutes in a population of some 300,000. An enterprising printer published a catalogue of all the principal and most honored courtesans of Venice, their names, addresses, and fees. On the roads, they frequented taverns. In the cities, they were the favorite guests of young blades and fervent artists. Cellini recounts his night's lodging with a courtesan as an incident of no moment, and describes a dinner of artists, including Giulio Romano and himself, in which each man was required to bring a woman of low resistance. At a higher level, the banker Lorenzo Strozzi gave a banquet in 1519 to 14 persons, including 4 cardinals and 3 women of the demimonde. As wealth and refinement increased, a demand arose for courtesans with some education and social charm, and as in the Athens of Sophocles, hetairae rose to meet this demand, so in the Rome of the late 15th century, and in the Venice of the 16th, a class of cortigiane oneste, genteel courtesans, developed, who rivaled the finest ladies in dress, manners, culture, even in hebdomadal piety. While the simpler prostitutes, cortigiane di candela, practiced in brothels, these Roman hetairae lived in their own homes, entertained lavishly, read and wrote poetry, sang and played music, and joined in educated conversation. Some collected pictures and statuary, rare editions, and the latest books. Some maintained literary salons. To keep up with the humanists, many of them took classical names: Camilla, Polyxena, Penthesilea, Faustina, Imperia, Tullia. One scandalous wit, in the pontificate of Alexander VI, wrote a series of epigrams beginning with a number in praise of the Virgin or the saints, and then, without a blush, continuing with several in honor of the distinguished courtesans of his time. When one such, Faustina Mancina, died, half of Rome mourned her, and Michelangelo was one of many who wrote sonnets to her memory. The most renowned of these cortigiane oneste was Imperia de Cugnatis. Made rich by her patron Agostino Chigi, she adorned her home with luxurious furniture and choice art, and gathered about her a bevy of scholars, artists, poets, and churchmen. Even the pious Sadoleto sang her praise. Probably it was Imperia whom Raphael took as his model for the Sappho of his Parnassus. She died in the flower of her beauty at the age of 26 in 1511, and received honorable burial in the church of San Gregorio, with a marble tomb engraved in the finest lapidary style. And 100 poets lamented her in classic elegies. Her daughter killed herself rather than submit to seduction. Almost as renowned was Tullia d'Aragona, illegitimate daughter of the Cardinal of Aragon. Admired for her golden hair and sparkling eyes, her generosity and carelessness with money, her grace of carriage and charm of conversation, she was received in Naples, Rome, Florence, and Ferrara like a visiting princess. The Mantuan ambassador at Ferrara described her entry in an undiplomatic letter to Isabella d'Este in 1537. I have to record the arrival among us of a gentle lady, so modest in behavior, so fascinating in manners that we cannot help considering her something divine. She sings impromptu all kinds of airs and motets. There is not one lady in Ferrara, not even Vittoria Colonna, the Duchess of Pescara, who can stand comparison with Tullia. Moretto da Brescia painted a bewitching portrait of her, looking as innocent as a novice nun. She made the mistake of outliving her charms. She died in a wretched hut near the Tiber, and her total belongings at auction brought a dozen crowns, or around $150. But in all her poverty she had kept her lute and harpsichord to the last. She left also a book that she had composed on the infinity of perfect love. Doubtless that title reflected the Renaissance fashion of talking and writing about platonic love. If a woman could not commit adultery, she might at least allow herself to arouse in a man a kind of poetic gallantry that made her the object of verses, courtesies, and dedications. The devotions of the troubadours, the Vita Nuova of Dante, and Plato's discourses on spiritual love had begotten in a few circles a fine sentiment of adoration toward woman, usually another man's wife. Most people paid no attention to the idea, preferring their love in a frankly sensual form. They might write sonnets, but their goal was coitus, and hardly once in 100 cases, despite the novelists, did they marry the object of their love. For marriage was an affair of property, and property could not be made dependent upon the passing whims of physical desire. Betrothals were arranged by family councils, and most young people accepted without effectual protest the mates so assigned to them. Girls could be betrothed at the age of 3, though marriage had to be delayed till 12. In the 15th century, a daughter unmarried at 15 was a family disgrace. In the 16th century, the age of disgrace was deferred to 17 to allow time for higher education. Men, who enjoyed all the privileges and facilities of promiscuity, could be lured into marriage only by brides bringing substantial dowries. In Savonarola's day, there were many marriageable girls who, for lack of dowries, had failed to find a husband. Florence established a kind of state dowry insurance, Monte delle Fanciulle, or Fund of the Maidens, from which marriage portions were given to girls that had paid small yearly premiums. In Siena there were so many bachelors that the laws had to inflict legal disabilities upon them. In Lucca, a decree of 1454 debarred from public office all unmarried men between 20 and 50. The times are not favorable to matrimony, wrote Alessandro Strozzi in 1455. Raphael painted 100 Madonnas, but would not take a wife, and this was the one thing in which Michelangelo agreed with him. Weddings themselves consumed enormous sums. Leonardo Bruni complained that his matrimonium had squandered his patrimonium. Kings and queens, princes and princesses spent $500,000 on a wedding while famine raged among the people. When Alfonso the Magnificent of Naples married, he set up tables for 30,000 diners on the shores of the bay. Lovelier was the reception that Urbino gave to Duke Guidobaldo when he brought from Mantua his bride Elisabetta Gonzaga. Ranged on a hill slope stood the ladies of the city, beautifully dressed. Before them their children carried olive branches. Mounted choristers in graceful formation sang a cantata that had been composed for the occasion. And an especially comely matron, impersonating a goddess, offered the new duchess the loyalty and affection of the people. After marriage, the woman usually kept her own name, so Lorenzo's wife continued to be called Donna Clarice Orsini. Sometimes, however, the wife might add her husband's name to her own, Maria Salviati de' Medici. In the medieval theory of marriage, it was expected that love would develop between man and wife through the varied partnerships of marriage in joy and sorrow, prosperity and adversity. And apparently the expectation was fulfilled in the majority of cases. No love of youth for maiden could be deeper or truer than that of Vittoria Colonna for the Marquis of Pescara, to whom she had been engaged from the age of 4. No loyalty could have been greater than that of Elisabetta Gonzaga, accompanying her crippled husband through all his misfortunes and exiles, and faithful to his memory till her death. Nevertheless, adultery was rampant. Since most marriages among the upper classes were diplomatic unions of economic or political interests, many husbands felt warranted in having a mistress. And the wife, though she might mourn, usually closed her eyes, or her lips, to the offense. Among the middle classes, some men assumed that adultery was a legitimate diversion. Machiavelli and his friends seem to have thought nothing of exchanging notes about their infidelities. When in such cases the wife avenged herself by imitation, the husband was as like as not to ignore it and wear his horns with grace. But the influx of Spaniards into Italy via Naples and Alexander VI and Charles V brought the Spanish point of honor into Italian life, and in the 16th century the husband felt called upon to punish his wife's adultery with death, while preserving his pristine privileges unimpaired. The husband might desert his wife and still prosper. The deserted wife had no remedy except to reclaim her dowry, return to her relatives, and live a lonely life. She was not allowed to marry again. She might enter a convent, but it would expect a donation of her dowry. In general, in the Latin countries, adultery is condoned as a substitute for divorce. 4. Renaissance man. The combination of intellectual enfranchisement and moral release produced the man of the Renaissance. He was not typical enough to merit that title. There were a dozen types of man in that age, as in any other. He was merely the most interesting, perhaps because he was exceptional. The Renaissance peasant was what peasants have always been until machinery made agriculture an industry. The Italian proletaire of 1500 was like those of Rome under the Caesars or Mussolini. Occupation makes the man. The Renaissance businessman was like his past and present peers. The Renaissance priest, however, was different from the medieval or modern priest. He believed less and enjoyed more. He could make love and war. Amid these types was an arresting mutation, a sport of the species and the time, the kind of man we think of when we recall the Renaissance, a type unique in history, except that Alcibiades, seeing him, would have felt reborn. The qualities of this type revolved about two foci, intellectual and moral audacity. A mind sharp, alert, versatile, open to every impression and idea, sensitive to beauty, eager for fame. It was a recklessly individualistic spirit, set on developing all its potential capacities. A proud spirit, scorning Christian humility, despising weakness and timidity, defying conventions, morals, taboos, popes, even, occasionally, God. In the city, such a man might lead a turbulent faction. In the state, an army. In the church, he would gather 100 benefices under his cassock and use his wealth to climb to power. In art, he was no longer an artisan working anonymously with others on a collective enterprise, as in the Middle Ages. He was a single and separate person who stamped his character upon his works, signed his name to his paintings, even, now and then, carved it on his statues, like Michelangelo on the Pietà. Whatever his achievements, this Renaissance man was always in motion and discontent, fretting at limits, longing to be a universal man, bold in conception, decisive in deed, eloquent in speech, skilled in art, acquainted with literature and philosophy, at home with women in the palace and with soldiers in the camp. His immorality was part of his individualism, his goal being the successful expression of his personality, and his environment imposing upon him no standards of restraint, either from the example of the clergy or from the terror of a supernatural creed. He allowed himself any means to his ends, and any pleasure on the way. Nonetheless, he had his own virtues. He was a realist and seldom talked nonsense except to a reluctant woman. He had good manners when he was not killing, and even then he preferred to kill with grace. He had energy, force of character, direction and unity of will. He accepted the old Roman conception of virtue as manliness, but added to it skill and intelligence. He was not needlessly cruel, and he excelled the Romans in his capacity for pity. He was vain, but that was part of his sense of beauty and form. His appreciation of the beautiful in woman and nature, in art and crime, was a mainspring of the Renaissance. He replaced the moral with the aesthetic sense. If his type had multiplied and prevailed, an irresponsible aristocracy of taste would have supplanted the aristocracies of birth or wealth. But again, he was only one of many kinds of Renaissance man. How different was the idealistic Pico, with his belief in the moral perfectibility of mankind, or the grim Savonarola, blind to beauty and absorbed in righteousness, or the gentle, gracious Raphael, scattering beauty about him with an open hand, or the demonic Michelangelo, haunted with the Last Judgment long before he painted it, or the melodious Politian, who thought there could be pity even in hell, or the honest Vittorino da Feltre, so successfully binding Zeno to Christ, or the second Giuliano de' Medici, so kindly just that his brother the Pope considered him unfit for government. We perceive, after every effort to abbreviate and formulate, that there was no man of the Renaissance. There were men agreeing only in one thing, that life had never been lived so intensely before. The Middle Ages had said, or had pretended to say, no to life. The Renaissance, with all its heart and soul and might, said yes. 5. Renaissance Woman. The emergence of woman was one of the brightest phases of the period. Her status in European history has usually risen with wealth, though Periclean Greece, too near the Orient, was an exception. When hunger is no longer feared, the male quest turns to sex, and if man still despoils himself for gold, it is to lay it at a woman's feet, or before the children she has given him. If she resists him, he idealizes her. Usually she has the good sense to resist him, and to make him pay dearly for the boons whose contemplated splendor swells his veins. If, moreover, she adds graces of mind and character to her body's charms, she gives man the highest satisfaction he can find this side of glory, and in return he raises her to an almost queenly dominance in his life. We must not imagine that this was the pleasant role of the average woman in the Renaissance. It fell to a fortunate few, while the far greater number put off their bridal robes to carry domestic burdens and family headaches to their graves. Hear San Bernardino on the proper time for beating a wife. And I say to you, men, never beat your wives while they are great with child, for therein would lie great peril. I say not that you should never beat them, but choose your time. I know men who have more regard for a hen that lays a fresh egg daily than for their own wives. Sometimes the hen will break a pot or a cup, but the man will not beat her, for fear of losing the egg that is her fruit. How stark mad, then, are many that cannot suffer a word from their own lady who bears such fair fruit. For if she speak a word more than he thinks fit, forthwith he seizes a staff and begins to chastise her. And the hen, which cackles all day without ceasing, you suffer patiently for her egg's sake. A girl of good family was carefully trained for success in getting and keeping a prosperous mate. This was the major subject of her curriculum. Till a few weeks before marriage, she was kept in relative seclusion in a convent or in the home, and received from her tutors or nuns an education as thorough as that which came to all but the scholars among the men of her class. Usually she learned some Latin and became distantly acquainted with the leading figures of Greek and Roman history, literature, and philosophy. She practiced some form of music, and sometimes played at sculpture or painting. A few women became scholars and publicly debated problems of philosophy with men, like the learned Cassandra Fedeli of Venice, but this was highly exceptional. Several women wrote good verse, like Costanza Varano, Veronica Gambara, and Vittoria Colonna. But the educated woman of the Renaissance retained her femininity, her Christianity, and its moral code, and this gave her a union of culture and character that made her irresistible to the higher Renaissance man. For the lettered men of that age felt her attractiveness intensely, even to writing and reading books that analyzed her charms in scholarly detail. Agnolo Firenzuola, a Vallambrosan monk, composed a dialogue Sopra la bellezza delle donne, on the beauty of women, and carried off this difficult subject with a skill and erudition hardly becoming a monk. Beauty itself he defines after Plato and Aristotle as an orderly concord, a harmony inscrutably resulting from the composition, union, and commission of divers members, each of which shall itself be well-proportioned and in a certain sense beautiful, but which, before they combine to make one body, shall be different and discrepant among themselves. He proceeds to examine with finesse every part of the feminine frame, laying down the standard of beauty for each. The hair should be thick, long, and blonde, a soft yellow nearing brown, the skin bright and clear, but not pale white, the eyes dark, large, and full, with touches of blue in a white iris. The nose must not be aquiline, for that is especially disconcerting in a woman. The mouth should be small, but the lips full, the chin round and dimpled, the neck round and rather long, but let not Adam's apple show. The shoulders should be broad, the bosom full, with a gentle fall and swell, the hands white and plump and soft, the legs long, the feet small. We perceive that Firenzuola had spent much time contemplating his subject, and had discovered an admirable new topic for philosophy. Not content with these gifts, Renaissance woman, like any other, dyed her hair, almost always to blonde, and added false locks to fill it out. Peasant women, having spent their beauty, cut off their tresses and hung them out for sale. Perfumes were a mania in 16th century Italy. Hair, hats, shirts, stockings, gloves, shoes, all had to be scented. Aretino thanks Duke Cosimo for perfuming the roll of money he had sent him. Some objects that date from that period have not yet lost their odor. A well-to-do woman's dressing table was a wilderness of cosmetics, usually in fancy containers of ivory, silver, or gold. Rouge was applied not only to the face but to the breasts, which in the larger cities were left mostly bare. Various preparations were used to remove blemishes, to polish the fingernails, to render the skin soft and smooth. Flowers were placed in the hair and on the dress. Pearls, diamonds, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, agates, amethysts, beryls, topazes, or garnets adorned the fingers in rings, the arms in bracelets, the head in tiaras, and, after 1525, the ears in earrings. Besides which, jewelry might be studded into the headgear, the dress, the shoes, and the fan. Feminine dress, if we may judge from the portraits, was rich, heavy, and uncomfortable. Velvets, silks, and furs hung in massive folds from the shoulders, or, when the shoulders were bare, from fastenings over the breasts. Dresses were bound with a girdle at the waist and swept the floor behind the feet. The shoes of the well-to-do woman were high of both sole and heel to protect her feet from the filth of the streets. Nevertheless, the upper portion was often of delicate brocade. Handkerchiefs were now in use in the upper classes. They were made of fine linen, often striped with gold thread or fringed with lace. Petticoats and lingerie were trimmed with lace and embroidered with silk. Sometimes the dress reached up around the neck in a ruff stiffened with metal ribs, and occasionally rising above the head. The headdress of the woman took 100 forms: turbans, tiaras, kerchiefs or veils bound with pearls, hoods stiffly shaped with wire, caps like a boy's or a forester's. Frenchmen visiting Mantua were delightfully shocked to find the Marchioness Isabella wearing a fancy cap with jeweled feathers, and, beneath, shoulders and bosom bare almost to the nipples. Preachers complained about the amount of female bosom that invited the male eye. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.